The chipped porcelain doll's eyes stared from the dusty shelf, and Martha Young felt a prickle of something cold crawl up her spine. It wasn't the doll itself, not really. Martha had a morbid fascination with the macabre, a trait that made her an excellent reporter for the local paper specializing in the bizarre goings on of Blackwood Creek. But this doll, a faded calico thing with yarn hair and a perpetually surprised expression, had been sitting there, on the shelf in the abandoned nursery for at least a week. It hadn't moved, it hadn't shifted, and yet Martha swore it's glass. I had tracked her as she'd stepped over the threshold of the dilapidated farmhouse. The air inside was thick with the scent of decay and something else, something vaguely metallic, like old pennies left too long in the rain. Her flashlight beam, a nervous tremor of light, danced across peeling wallpaper depicting cheerful, sun-drenched farm animals that now seemed like mocking ghosts. Her cat, a sleek shadow named Midnight, usually a creature of unflappable curiosity, pressed itself against Martha's ankles, a low rumble of unease vibrating through its small body. Midnight's fur was raised, his tail twitching with a tension Martha rarely saw. He'd been like this since they'd arrived at the edge of town, a rigid, watchful statue. The house, according to the locals, had been empty for 13 years, ever since the entire Hemlock family had vanished without a trace. No bodies, no notes, just gone. The property had been on the market for years, a real estate pariah no one dared to touch, its reputation as poisoned as the soil surrounding it. Martha, ever the skeptic with a nose for a good story, had finally convinced the reluctant real estate agent to give her a peek inside, armed with her notebook, her camera, and a healthy dose of bravado. The floorboards groaned a mournful protest under her weight as she ventured deeper into the house. Midnight a silent, watchful shadow at her heels. Dust motes, fat and lazy, swirled in the weak shafts of sunlight that pierced the grimy windows. Each room told a story of sudden, abrupt departure. A half-eaten meal sat petrified on a dining room table, a fork suspended midair as if time itself had hiccuped. In the living room, a deck of cards lay scattered on the floor, a game interrupted by an unseen hand. It was the sheer normalcy of the abandonment that unnerved Martha more than any overt sign of struggle. It spoke of a mundane terror, something that had simply scooped them up and carried them away. She tried to shake off the feeling, reminding herself that these were just old houses, old objects, imbued with the residue of lives long past. But the unnerving stillness of the place, the way the silence seemed to press in on her, felt too deliberate, too expectant. It was like being inside a breath held too long. She found herself in what must have been the master bedroom, a grander space than the others, though equally choked with dust and neglect. A large, ornate vanity mirror, its silvering clouded with age, dominated one wall. Martha angled her flashlight towards it, and for a fleeting second she saw a flicker of movement in the periphery, a dark shape darting behind her reflection. She spun around, heart hammering against her ribs, but there was nothing, only the oppressive silence and the ever-present scent of decay. Midnight let out a soft hiss, his gaze fixed on the corner of the room, a corner that appeared empty to Martha's eyes. He nudged her leg, a silent plea to leave. "Just a draft boy," Martha murmured, though her voice trembled. The sheer weight of the house's history seemed to settle on her shoulders, a palpable pressure. She felt an overwhelming urge to flee, to run back to the relative sanity of the outside world. But a reporter's stubborn curiosity, that ever-present itch, kept her rooted. She had to know, she had to understand what had happened here. The thought of the hemlock swallowed by this house gnawed at her. Suddenly, a soft thud came from the direction of the nursery. Martha froze, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't the creak of old wood or the sigh of the wind. It was a distinct, deliberate sound like something being dropped. Her flashlight beam swung back towards the nursery door, her hand tightening around the cool metal of the flashlight. Midnight let out a low growl, a sound that sent a shiver down Martha's spine. He was no longer pressing against her legs. He was a coiled spring ready to bolt or fight. The sheer wrongness of the sound, the unnatural stillness of the house that had now been broken, was more terrifying than any scream. It implied a presence, a deliberate action in a place meant to be dead and empty. This wasn't just an abandoned house anymore. Something was here, and it knew she was here too. The doll's eye, she realized with a sickening lurch, hadn't just been watching her, it had been waiting. The game Martha suspected was about to get rough. The thud echoed in Martha's ears, a percussive punctuation to the suffocating silence. It wasn't a sound that belonged in an abandoned house. It was too solid, too real. Midnight's growl deepened, a low, guttural rumble that vibrated through the floorboards and up Martha's legs. He was no longer just tense, he was actively hostile, his body a low-slung projectile of fur and fury, pointed at the nursery doorway. Martha, despite the tremor that ran through her hands, forced herself to swing her flashlight beam back towards the source of the noise. The light, a meager weapon against the encroaching darkness, danced over the peeling wallpaper, the dusty floor, the abandoned crib. Nothing, just the same desolate tableau she'd seen moments before. But Midnight's unwavering focus, the rigid set of his ears, told her otherwise. He saw something. He knew something. Martha took a hesitant step forward, her boots crunching on fallen plaster. The air in the hallway felt heavier now, charged with a palpable tension. It was the kind of stillness that precedes a storm, a held breath before the world shatters. She could almost taste the dust, thick and cloying on her tongue, mingled with that faint, metallic tang. The doll's eye from the shelf, she imagined, was still fixed on her, a tiny glass sentinel in the gloom. She edged closer to the nursery door. Midnight a silent, wary sentinel at her side, his tail now tucked, a sign of genuine fear. The thud had been followed by a faint, scuffling sound, like something being dragged across a rough surface. It was too faint to be certain, too easily dismissed as the house settling, but Martha's reporter's instinct, honed by years of chasing down the improbable, refused to let it go. This was more than just an old house with a history. This was a house with a secret, and that secret was stirring. She pushed the nursery door open, the hinges groaning in protest. The room was bathed in the sickly grey light filtering through the grimy windows. The doll was still on the shelf, its yarn hair askew, its painted smile frozen. But the small wooden rocking horse, which had been standing perfectly still near the window, was now facing the door, its painted eyes wide and vacant, as if it had just been ridden. And there, on the floor in front of it, was a small, dark smear. It wasn't large, but it was undeniably wet. Martha knelt, her flashlight beam unwavering. It looked like blood. Fresh blood. Her stomach churned. This wasn't a draft. This wasn't the house settling. This was something else entirely. A Kingmaker of fear was at work here, pulling the strings of her apprehension, making her jump at every shadow, every whisper of the wind. The scent of metal was stronger now, almost overpowering. Midnight let out a soft whine, nudging her hand with his head, a desperate plea to leave. Martha's mind raced. 13 years since the Hemlocks had vanished. What if they hadn't vanished? What if they were still here, trapped, unable to leave? The thought was absurd, a product of too many late-night horror movies and too much caffeine. But the blood, the rocking horse, the unnerving stillness that had been broken by that deliberate thud, it all pointed to something deeply, terrifyingly wrong. She stood up, her legs feeling strangely weak. She had to get out. Now. But as she turned to leave, her flashlight beam swept across the far wall, and she saw it. Scratched into the peeling wallpaper, crude and jagged, were a series of symbols. They were unlike anything she'd ever seen, a chaotic mess of lines and curves that seemed to writhe in the flickering light. And beneath them, scrawled in what looked like dried mud, was a single word. It was scrawled with a desperate, urgent hand, and it sent a fresh wave of dread washing over Martha. The word was mine. The word mine seared itself into Martha's vision. A stark declaration against the faded floral wallpaper. It was written with a frantic, desperate energy, the letters uneven and thick, as if the writer had been holding something heavy, or perhaps had been in a terrible hurry. The dried mud looked disturbingly like blood, and Martha's imagination, that overactive, horror-loving engine, conjured images of a child's desperate scrawl, a final, futile attempt to reclaim something lost. Midnight, sensing her heightened panic, let out a soft, distressed meow, rubbing his head against her leg, a silent offering of comfort. The rocking horse, now motionless, seemed to mock her with its painted cheerfulness, its vacant eyes staring at the wall, at the horrifying testament left behind. Martha's reporter's brain, usually a well-oiled machine of fact-finding and deduction, felt sluggish, fogged by a growing primal fear. This wasn't a story about a family vanishing. This was a story about something that remained, something that claimed ownership. The air in the room felt thick, almost viscous, making each breath a conscious effort. She could feel the hairs on her arms prickle, the tiny hairs standing on end as if sensing a hostile presence. The silence that had returned after the scuffling had been broken was now more menacing than before, a pregnant pause before an inevitable, horrifying revelation. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that she had to leave. Now, before whatever had made that mark, before whatever claimed this place as its own, decided she was also mine. She backed out of the nursery, her eyes never leaving the wall, the single word a brand on her memory. Midnight followed close behind, a furry vibrating alarm system. As she reached the hallway, a floorboard creaked directly behind her. Martha spun around, her flashlight beam cutting a frantic arc through the darkness. Nothing. But the sound had been too distinct, too immediate. It wasn't the settling of an old house. It was the sound of weight being placed, of movement. She could feel a cold draft, a sudden drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the crumbling insulation. It felt like walking through a patch of ice. She was no longer alone. The house had become a trap. And she, the unwitting interloper, was now its intended prey. The sheer, unadulterated terror was a physical thing, coiling in her gut, tightening her chest. She had come seeking a story, but she had stumbled into something far older, far more terrifying. The whispers of the locals about the Hemlock house, dismissed as superstition, now felt like dire warnings. She didn't dare look back as she hurried down the hallway, her boots clattering on the bare wood. The doll's eye, she imagined, was still watching, a silent witness to her frantic retreat. The metallic scent seemed to cling to her, a phantom perfume of dread. She fumbled with the front door, her fingers numb and clumsy. The rough wood felt alien beneath her touch. Just as she managed to twist the rusted doorknob, a sound from upstairs froze her. It was a soft, rhythmic thudding, like a child's gentle bouncing. It was coming from the nursery, and it was getting louder. Midnight let out a sharp, distressed yowl, digging his claws into the worn rug, refusing to budge. Martha's heart hammered against her ribs, a drumbeat of pure, unadulterated panic. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and it was playing a cruel, terrifying game. The thudding continued, a relentless lullaby of dread beckoning her back, promising something she both desperately wanted to escape, and with a morbid fascination she couldn't quite suppress needed to understand. The thudding from upstairs was a persistent, maddening pulse, each beat a tiny hammer blow against Martha's sanity. It wasn't the desperate, frantic rhythm of something trapped. It was a steady, almost playful cadence, like a child bouncing a ball. But the ball, Martha knew with a certainty that settled cold and heavy in her stomach, was no longer a ball. Midnight, usually her steadfast companion, was a statue of terrified fur, his body rigid, his pupils dilated into black pools. He refused to move from the threshold, his low growl a constant tremor in the air. The rough texture of the porch beneath Martha's trembling fingers felt like sandpaper against her skin. She could feel the house breathing, a slow, deliberate inhale and exhale of dust and decay. Martha forced herself to look back, to let her flashlight beam crawl up the shadowed stairwell. The thudding continued, a sonic manifestation of the house's malevolent will. It was an invitation, she realized with a sickening lurch, a siren song sung in the language of primal fear. The word mine on the nursery wall flashed in her mind, a stark reminder of what awaited her if she lingered. If she succumbed to the morbid curiosity that had always been her undoing, she had to get out. This was no longer a story, it was a desperate fight for survival. The air, once merely stale, now felt thick with an unseen presence, a suffocating weight that pressed in on her from all sides. It was like being submerged in a pool of stagnant water. Suddenly the thudding stopped. The silence that descended was more terrifying than the noise. It was a predatory silence, the quiet anticipation before a pounce. Martha held her breath, straining to hear anything, any sign of movement. Then, a new sound, a soft, scraping whisper, like fingernails dragging across wood, emanating from the nursery. It was slow, deliberate, and it was getting closer. Martha's blood ran cold. This wasn't a game anymore. This was a hunt. She could feel eyes on her, unseen, unblinking from every dark corner of the house. The entire structure seemed to hum with a low, expectant energy, as if waiting for her to make a mistake. She knew, with a bone-deep certainty, that she had pushed her luck too far. The Hemlock house was not just abandoned, it was occupied, and its occupant was not welcoming visitors. A faint, childlike giggle, thin and reedy, drifted down the stairs. It was a sound that scraped against Martha's nerves, a sound that promised an innocence long since corrupted. She didn't need to see it to know it was there. Whatever was in that house, whatever had claimed it, was playing with her. And Martha Young, the intrepid reporter, was the unwitting star of its gruesome, macabre show. She finally broke. Turning and bolting, not daring to look back, the image of the doll's unblinking eye and the scrawled word, "Mind," burned into her mind. Midnight, with a final fearful glance at the house, finally followed his pause of frantic patter on the dusty porch. The rough wood seemed to try and snag her, to hold her back, but Martha scrambled over it, her lungs burning, her heart a frantic hummingbird in her chest. The house stood silent behind her, a hulking silhouette against the darkening sky, a kingmaker of nightmares waiting for its next visitor. The crunch of gravel under Martha. Tyre's was a symphony of escape, each revolution a testament to her desperate flight. She didn't dare look in the rearview mirror, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel, her gaze fixed on the receding oppressive shape of the Hemlock house. The engine's roar was a comforting counterpoint to the suffocating silence she, Dee, left behind, a tangible barrier between her and the unseen horrors that lurked within its decaying walls. Midnight, no longer a statue of terror, was curled on the passenger seat, his small body still trembling, his fur bristled as if he could still feel the unseen eyes watching them. Martha's own body felt like a coiled spring, every muscle tense, every nerve frayed. The metallic scent, she realized with a shudder, had followed her, a faint, lingering perfume of dread clinging to her clothes, her hair, her very skin. She drove for miles, the familiar landscape of Blackwood Creek blurring into an indistinct smear of green and grey. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to mimic the twisted shapes she de-glimpsed within the house. The locals' hushed warnings, once dismissed as rural folklore, now echoed in her mind with chilling clarity. They spoke of the house as a place that took, a place that kept what it claimed. The crude word mine, scrawled on the nursery wall, was a constant, damning reminder of that possessive hunger. Martha's reporter, rattled, was already beginning to piece together fragments of the Hemlock family disappearance, searching for any detail, any anomaly that might explain the impossible. Was it some kind of environmental contamination, local cult, or something far older, far more inexplicable? She pulled into the brightly lit parking lot of a 24-hour diner, the fluorescent glow a jarring, almost violent contrast to the gloom Dee escaped. The air inside was thick with the smell of stale coffee and fried food, a welcome assault on her senses, a grounding presence of normalcy. She slid into a booth, Midnight still tucked close to her side, his presence a small comfort in the vastness of her fear. She ordered a coffee, black, and a plate of fries, her hands still shaking as she reached for the salt shaker. The rough, textured surface of the laminated menu felt strangely comforting. As she waited for her order, her gaze fell on a faded newspaper clipping tacked to the wall behind the counter. It was old, yellowed with age, but the headline was still legible: "Local family vanishes without a trace." Below it was a grainy photo of the Hemlock family. Smiling couple, 2 young children, their faces full of the innocent joy that Martha had seen so brutally mocked by the rocking horse. The article spoke of an exhaustive search, of baffled authorities, of a town gripped by fear. It mentioned the 13 years of silence, the house standing empty, a blight on the community. Then her eyes caught on a small detail at the bottom of the clipping, a detail she'd never seen before. A small, almost insignificant mention of a local legend, a whispered tale of a Kingmaker spirit that resided in the woods surrounding the Hemlock property, a creature that fed on fear and claimed what it desired. The description was vague, shrouded in folklore, but it resonated with a chilling familiarity. Martha felt a cold dread creep back into her bones. She had come seeking a story, a sensational headline, but she had found something far more ancient, far more terrifying. The house wasn't just a building. It was a vessel, a prison, and the Kingmaker was its warden. And it had just made its claim. The diner's fluorescent lights hummed a sickly tune, a stark contrast to the oppressive silence. Martha had fled. The newspaper clipping with its grainy photo of the smiling Hemlock family lay on the table, a stark reminder of the innocent lives swallowed by the house. Martha's coffee, though hot, did little to chase away the chill that had settled deep within her bones. The metallic scent seemed to have intensified, a phantom coppery tang that made her stomach churn. Midnight, usually content to observe the diner's comings and goings with feline aloofness, remained pressed against her side, his fur still slightly raised, his tail twitching with an anxiety that mirrored her own. The mention of the Kingmaker legend, once dismissed as mere superstition, now felt like a spotlight illuminating the true horror of the Hemlock house. It wasn't just a place. It was a hungry entity, a predator that lured its prey with promises of normalcy before revealing its true terrifying nature. Martha's mind, a whirlwind of fear and journalistic instinct, began to churn. If the Kingmaker was real, if it was tied to the Hemlock property, then its influence might extend beyond the crumbling walls of the house. The whispers from the locals, the hushed tales of odd occurrences in Blackwood Creek, began to take on a new sinister significance. Had the Kingmaker been responsible for other disappearances? Had it been subtly at work in this seemingly quiet town for years, its tendrils slowly, insidiously weaving themselves into the fabric of everyday life? The rough, worn surface of the diner table beneath her fingertips felt solid, grounding, a welcome contrast to the shifting realities she had just experienced. She needed more information, more than just the vague folklore. She needed to understand the nature of this entity, to find its weaknesses if it had any. She pulled out her notebook, the familiar weight of it a small comfort. Her pen hovered over the blank page, her mind racing. The symbols on the nursery wall. The word, mine. They weren't just random scribbles. They were clues. They were a language, a twisted form of communication from something ancient and malevolent. She tried to recall every detail, every sensation from her time inside the house. The doll's eyes, the rocking horse, the oppressive atmosphere. The chilling giggle Tweety each element was a piece of a puzzle that promised a terrifying picture. The metallic scent she thought was it a byproduct of the Kingmaker's presence, or a warning, a physical manifestation of its hunger. Her coffee had gone cold, and the fries lay untouched. She was no longer hungry for food. She was hungry for answers, for a way to understand, and perhaps, just perhaps, a way to fight back. The idea of fighting back felt ludicrous, like a mouse challenging a hawk. But the thought of the Hemlock children, their innocent faces now a torment, spurred her on. She glanced at Midnight, who let out a soft purr, a small vibration of reassurance against her leg. He seemed to sense her resolve, the shift from pure panic to a determined, if terrified, quest for understanding. The diner's owner, a burly man with weary eyes, ambled over to clear away her untouched food. He nodded at the newspaper clipping. "That old house," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Folks around here don't talk about it much anymore. Best to leave it be." Martha looked up at him, her gaze sharp, her reporter's instinct kicking in. "You know anything about the Kingmaker legend?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. The man's face tightened, a flicker of unease crossing his features. He hesitated, then leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Some say it is not a spirit, not like ghosts. Some say it is older, a thing that grows, a thing that feeds. And it likes to play with its food before it takes it." The diner owner's words hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. A thing that grows, a thing that feeds, and it likes to play with its food before it takes it. Martha felt a fresh wave of nausea, the metallic tang in the air suddenly seeming to emanate from the very words themselves. The Kingmaker, not a ghost, but something primal, something that Twivertoo fed. It explained the feeling of being watched, of being toyed with. The rough texture of the diner booth seemed to vibrate with a low hum, an echo of the house's oppressive presence. Midnight, sensing Martha's heightened distress, nudged her hand with his head, a silent, furry anchor in the storm of her thoughts. She thanked the owner, her mind already racing ahead, piecing together the fragments. If the Kingmaker grew, it needed sustenance. And its sustenance was fear, despair, perhaps even life itself. The Hemlock family hadn't just vanished. They had been consumed. The symbols on the wall, the word mine, they were the marks of its consumption, the territorial claims of a monstrous hunger. Martha's reporter's instincts, though tempered by a healthy dose of terror, were now fully engaged. She needed to understand this entity, to find out how it operated, how it fed, and most importantly, if it could be stopped. The thought of another family, another person, falling victim to this thing was unbearable. She paid her bill, the crumpled bills feeling strangely slick in her clammy hands. Stepping back out into the rapidly darkening night, the air felt cooler, crisper, but the lingering scent of metal seemed to follow her, a phantom reminder of the house. She got back into her car, Midnight settling onto the passenger seat with a soft sigh. She didn't drive home. Instead, she pointed her headlights towards the town library, a place she'd often visited for research. If the Kingmaker was an old thing, an ancient entity, then its history, its origins, might be buried in the archives, in dusty tomes of local history and forgotten folklore. The rough asphalt of the road seemed to hum beneath her tires, a prelude to the deeper, more sinister hum she associated with the Hemlock house. The library was a quiet sanctuary, its hushed atmosphere a welcome respite. The librarian, a stern-faced woman named Mrs. Gable, greeted her with a quizzical look, her eyes lingering on Martha's disheveled appearance. Martha, forcing a strained smile, explained she was working on a historical piece about Blackwood Creek. She spent hours poring over brittle documents, microfiche reels, and ancient, leather-bound books. She searched for any mention of unusual disappearances, of strange entities, of anything that resonated with the Kingmaker legend. Midnight, curled in her lap, occasionally twitched his ears, as if sensing the deeper currents of unease Martha was uncovering. The silence of the library was profound, broken only by the soft whirring of the microfilm reader and the occasional rustle of pages. She found fleeting references veiled in allegory and metaphor to a shadow that walks, a hunger that dwells in the roots of the earth, a kingmaker of despair. Each mention sent a fresh shiver down her spine, confirming her growing dread. The Kingmaker wasn't just a local legend, it was an ancient evil, a parasitic force that had been lurking in the shadows of Blackwood Creek for centuries. The microfiche read a word, a persistent mechanical heartbeat in the hushed sanctity of the library. Martha's eyes, strained and dry, scanned the grainy images of faded newspaper articles, each one a breadcrumb leading deeper into the mire of Blackwood Creek's hidden history. Mrs. Gable, the librarian, moved with a soft, almost spectral grace, her stern facade softening slightly as she observed Martha's intense focus. Midnight, a warm weight in Martha's lap, occasionally let out a soft purr, a tiny anchor of normalcy in the swirling vortex of dread. The metallic scent, Martha noticed with a grim sort of satisfaction, had faded in the dry, papery air of the library, replaced by the comforting aroma of old books and lemon polish. She found it in a brittle, leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and foxed with age. The author, a reclusive local historian named Elias Thorne, had documented tales of a shadow that walks, a parasitic entity that fed not on flesh, but on fear and despair. Thorne's writings spoke of its cyclical nature, of its periods of dormancy followed by surges of voracious hunger. He described its methods with chilling detail, subtle manipulations, whispers of doubt, the amplification of anxieties until they festered into crippling dread. The Hemlock family's disappearance, Thorne theorized, was a prime example of the Kingmaker's influence, a culmination of amplified fears that ultimately led to their consumption. He spoke of symbols, crude markings left behind as a testament to its claim, and a peculiar affinity for places where innocence had been corrupted. The nursery, the doll, the rocking horse. Martha's hand trembled as she carefully turned the rough, brittle page. Thorne had theorized that the Kingmaker's power was rooted in its ability to isolate its victims, to sever their connections to the outside world, to make them believe they were utterly alone. This explained the suffocating stillness of the house, the way it seemed to press in on her, trying to sever her own connection to reality. He also mentioned, in a passage that made Martha's blood run cold, a specific weakness the Kingmaker recoiled from: genuine, unwavering connection. Not the superficial bonds of acquaintance, but the deep, unconditional love and loyalty that existed between beings who truly understood and protected each other. It thrived on isolation, and it was repelled by unity. Martha looked down at Midnight, who blinked slowly up at her, his amber eyes filled with an unwavering trust. A sudden chill, independent of the library's climate controls, swept through Martha. Thorne's journal hinted at a more ancient, even more disturbing aspect of the Kingmaker. It wasn't just a passive feeder. It was a Kingmaker, a sculptor of despair, a force that could twist and corrupt, using its victims as pawns in its own dark games. He wrote of how it could imbue objects with its essence, creating conduits for its influence. The doll, the rocking horse. These weren't just abandoned toys. They were tainted, imbued with the Kingmaker's hunger, designed to lure and to trap. Martha felt a profound sense of urgency wash over her. She had to return. She had to confront it, armed with this knowledge. The thought of facing the Kingmaker again sent a tremor of fear through her, but it was now mixed with a nascent sense of purpose. She couldn't let the Hemlock's fate be repeated. She couldn't let this thing continue to feed. The rough, aged paper beneath her fingertips felt like a lifeline, a tangible link to a past that held the key to understanding the present horror. The night had deepened, the library's glow now a distant beacon as Martha drove back towards the Hemlock house. The metallic scent, though faint, seemed to have returned, a subtle herald of the darkness she was willingly re-entering. Midnight, usually content to nap through car rides, was awake and alert, his gaze fixed on the road ahead, his low growl a constant hum against the engine's drone. Martha's grip on the steering wheel was firm, her knuckles white, but her mind was clearer than it had been in days. Elias Thorne's journal, tucked safely in her bag, was a fragile shield, a source of knowledge against the encroaching dread. The Kingmaker fed on fear and isolation, and its weakness, Thorne had written, was unwavering connection. She parked the car a good distance from the house, the rough terrain making a closer approach risky in the dark. The house loomed against the star-dusted sky, a hulking silhouette of despair. The silence that emanated from it was no longer just an absence of sound. It was a palpable entity, a suffocating blanket of dread. Martha took a deep breath, the metallic tang sharp and acrid in her nostrils. She could feel it now, the low thrum of the Kingmaker's presence, a vibration that seemed to emanate from the very earth beneath her feet. Midnight nudged her hand, his purr a soft rumble, a silent promise of companionship. He was her connection, her unwavering ally, and in that moment, Martha felt a flicker of defiance ignite within her. She approached the house slowly, her flashlight beam cutting a hesitant path through the overgrown weeds. The front door, which had seemed so resistant before, now stood slightly ajar, an eerie invitation. The rough wood of the porch felt colder than before, almost unnaturally so. As she stepped inside, the air immediately grew heavy, thick with the cloying scent of decay, and that ever-present metallic tang. Midnight surprisingly didn't hesitate. He trotted ahead of her, his tail held high, a small, brave shadow leading the way. He seemed to sense the Kingmaker's influence, but instead of recoiling, he moved with a focused determination, as if he understood his role. The nursery was just as she remembered it, the doll's unblinking eyes seeming to follow her movements, the rocking horse frozen in its eerie stillness. But this time, Martha didn't shrink away. She walked directly towards the rocking horse, her flashlight beam steady. She ran her hand over its rough, painted surface, feeling the chipped layers of paint, the worn wood beneath. Thorn had said the Kingmaker could imbue objects. She had to break that connection. Midnight, now standing beside her, let out a soft meow, rubbing against her legs. Martha looked at him, at his unwavering presence, his silent strength. She knelt beside the rocking horse, and with all the strength she could muster, she whispered, "You are not alone. We are not alone." The words felt small against the oppressive weight of the house, but they were true. She had Midnight, had her. The metallic scent seemed to waver, to recede slightly, as if the Kingmaker's hunger had been momentarily disrupted. The metallic tang in the air seemed to recoil, a subtle but undeniable shift in the suffocating atmosphere of the nursery. Martha's whispered words, "You are not alone. We are not alone," hung in the oppressive silence, a tiny defiance against the ancient hunger. Midnight, a warm, vibrating presence against her leg, purred louder, his body a solid anchor of unwavering loyalty. The Kingmaker Thorn had written, thrived on isolation. It fed on the despair of being utterly and irrevocably alone. But Martha had Midnight, and Midnight had her. Their connection, forged in shared quiet nights and mutual understanding, was a force the Kingmaker couldn't comprehend, couldn't consume. Martha's gaze swept across the room, taking in the chipped porcelain doll, its vacant eyes now seeming to hold a flicker of confusion rather than malice. The rocking horse, once a conduit for the Kingmaker's influence, felt merely like old wood beneath her touch. The symbols on the wall, the crude scrawls that had promised ownership, now seemed faded, less potent. The Kingmaker denied its primary sustenance, seemed to be losing its grip. It wasn't a physical battle. It was a war of attrition, a contest of wills waged on the battlefield of fear and connection. Martha felt a surge of something akin to pity for the entity, a creature so consumed by its own need that it could never understand the strength found in unity. She looked at the doll, then at the rocking horse. They were just objects, imbued with a malevolent energy that was now being drained away. The Kingmaker, Martha realized, was like a parasite, its power dependent on its host. By severing its connection to these tainted objects, by asserting her own unwavering connection to Midnight, she was starving it. The oppressive weight of the house began to lift, the air growing lighter, the metallic scent fading with each passing moment. The stifling silence was replaced by the faint sounds of the night outside, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of leaves. It was the sound of the world reclaiming itself, of normalcy reasserting its gentle dominance. As Martha stood, Midnight rubbing against her ankles, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper drifted through the room. It wasn't a sound of anger or frustration, but of something ancient and weary, a sigh of defeat. Then, with a final, almost imperceptible shimmer, the oppressive atmosphere of the house dissipated entirely. The metallic scent was gone, replaced by the clean, earthy smell of dust and old wood. The doll's eyes seemed to stare with simple emptiness now, the rocking horse just a forgotten toy. The Kingmaker had retreated, its hunger momentarily sated by their brief, terrifying encounter, but its power here in this corrupted space had been broken. Martha, with Midnight by her side, walked out of the nursery, out of the house, and back into the quiet, ordinary night. The rough wood of the porch felt solid and unremarkable beneath her feet. The Hemlock house stood silent behind them, no longer a monument to fear, but a testament to the enduring power of connection.